But you leave this safety net and then you decided to play in the chaotic waters of politics. Why?
Yeah. So it's it's a good question.
You've criticized what you've called unsustainable borrowing. Why is that?
There's nothing wrong with government borrowing. The question is, what are you using the money for? In other words, if you borrow and you're spending ₦1 million, are you getting ₦1 million of value for the ₦1 million that you are spending? Right? Or are you awarding a contract for ₦1 million that could have been awarded for 100,000 naira? Those two things are very different from one another.
Why is transparency a cornerstone in your approach towards government?
If your intention is that this is what I want to accomplish, then your desire, your approach is more, how can I accomplish this thing that I want to accomplish? Do you see what I mean? That's why transparency, it is critical.
I'm very excited about the possibilities of this conversation because I've read a lot about you and I really want to tap from all that knowledge and experience that you hold. So first is looking back at your journey, because a lot of this conversation would reflect on leadership and your thoughts about building Lagos we want to see and even in Nigeria we want to see. Looking back, as someone who grew up in Yaba, did you expect that you'd become this person 30 years later, 40 years later?
So it's an interesting question. I don't know that I thought in great detail about, the kind of person I would become. Did I know I would become a professional? Yes. My dad was a professional. I was going to school, so it seemed pretty clear that I would be a professional. I knew I didn't want to be a doctor because my dad was a doctor. That much I knew, but but I knew I'd end up as a professional of some sort. And so that's what we all looked forward to. And we went to school, we got the degrees, and you got a good job and you started out that way, and then you took it from there. So I think that in terms of how it played out, at least at the beginning, I think it was not very different from what I would have thought. Of course, the journey since that point, has taken different twists and turns, which, one would not necessarily have foreseen. But we can get into more of that, and I'm sure we will get into more of that.
Okay. So I know that you spoke about you coming from a family where your dad was a medical doctor who owned his own private practice, and your mom worked with government, national.
Yeah, she worked with. She worked in, I guess, what would now be the civil service, but she worked at NEPA, which was the forerunner of the electricity industry. In fact, she worked at ECN, which is the Electricity Corporation of Nigeria, before it became NEPA. And she actually spent her entire career there. She spent about 35 years there and retired from there.
So I'm always intrigued by that because personally, a lot of the stories I grew up on and even the expectations of my parents was there was a pathway when you, maybe if you're going into finance, when you get into university, you start doing a professional course, maybe an ACC or an ICANN, all of that.
Yes.
There's a straight path to that. For you, looking at your own journey, was the path always that straight for you?
I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, obviously primary school, secondary school, university, all here in Lagos, by the way. And then I did youth service, which I taught in a rural community, in a rural secondary school. And then I came back and started work here. And I studied accounting. So it was pretty clear that if you studied accounting, you're going to do the professional exams. It's the rare accounting graduate that will not do the professional exams. So that sort of was the immediate path for me. And I joined what was then Arthur Andersen, which is now part of KPMG. And then I did the professional exams first 3 years out of school, and I qualified as a chartered accountant. The question then becomes at that point, what do you do with that? Do you remain in practice? Or do you move on into banking or move on to do other things, entrepreneurial things or what have you? And I would say, again, this is where maybe a bit of luck, maybe a bit of timing sort of came into it. I moved from there into the investment management industry, which is a subset of the finance industry. And it was an interesting time because it was very early in the industry. So you probably know about the investment industry, mutual funds, and those kinds of things, which are commonplace now, but actually we didn't have them then. So we're pioneering that actually. And so I managed one of the first mutual funds, which was then called the Equity Growth Fund. And so that was just an opportunity to come in and do something that was sort of entrepreneurial in an established industry, but doing things that, were sort of new and had not really been done in this environment. So that was a bit of because, most people went into banking or those kinds of traditional things. So this was an opportunity to do something that was less traditional, but in a sort of traditional industry. And so from there, I had the opportunity and because it was a young industry and all of that, I had the opportunity to take on a lot of responsibility very early. And therefore I rose quite, rapidly. And then from there, I went on to business school and then, onto other things and in sort of international investment industry. But that initial phase, I would call it the first 6 years, enabled me to basically transition a fairly standard education in a new and sort of maybe innovative direction, which I could then build on for the rest of my career.
So speaking about that, how does the conversation, so for a lot of people, especially when you're building something that didn't exist at the time, how did the conversation about making monies and making a career play with the responsibility of building something that you felt would be important for the industry?
So I would say that, again, I was fortunate in the sense that I could be a little bit of an entrepreneur rather than an entrepreneur, if you see what I mean. In other words, we were doing something that was entrepreneurial, but within a regular industry, if you see what I mean, right? Mm-hmm. So that entity in which I was doing this, ARM, was actually a subsidiary at the time of Guaranty Trust Bank, right? So it was within a larger corporate structure, but we had the freedom, we had the flexibility, we had the room to essentially move off in this direction and create this thing and so on and so. So in a way, we had the best of both worlds. We cheated a little bit, right? So it's not like the guy who steps out and goes and, establishes his business against all odds, sink or swim or what have you, which obviously those types of endeavors are really the engines of innovation and creativity and growth for economy. So those must really be supported. So we got the ability to do a little bit of both, right?
Because you were a leader at through secondary school and even university.
Yes.
Did the leadership at Corona, King's College, and university prepare you for your role as the MD of ARM Pension?
I would say yes.
How so?
And I say that because, in any leadership role, whether you're leading 2 people or you're leading 200 people or leading 2 million people, the fundamental thing is that you have responsibility for certain people. People expect certain things of you. You are occupying a position of trust, and you determine your approach to discharging that trust for the benefit of the people who appointed you or selected you, as it were. So if I take one of my very early experiences, for example, where in primary school, I had the good fortune of being appointed head boy in my primary school. which comes with its own responsibilities. And, you know, you have to essentially live up to certain standards. Presumably, there were certain things that people perhaps saw in you before deciding that of all the people they were going to appoint as head boy, you were the one they were going to appoint. And therefore, you didn't want to, I certainly didn't want to kind of let down that expectation. You know what I mean? And so that responsibility is something that you learn and that grows on you. And subsequent experiences, you build on it, So going into secondary school, going into university, where I led a, social philanthropic club called the ABC Club, which you may know about. This was a club where, we had good times, but we also tried to, do a little bit of giving back as well. Mm-hmm. Right. All of these are experiences where, people have reposed a trust in you and you are taking on that trust, and the attitude you take to that trust will determine whether or not, they feel comfortable to, extend that trust, give you a higher position of trust and responsibility and so on. And when you think about leadership, even in a corporate context, in a government context, the essence of it is the same, right? Wherever you're in a position of leadership, you just have to understand it as a trust. The good leader understands that as a trust, not for the benefit of yourself, or indeed even the benefit of the people who are very close to you, but for the benefit of all the people who have entrusted you with that responsibility. And so that's a core set of traits and skills that if you develop them from a young age, in my opinion, you can build on them throughout your career and just get to ever and ever increasing understanding and capacity for operating in that kind of role.
Looking back at your time in corporate, were there some hard decisions, like when you think about it, that you had to take that reflected on the people, and maybe you felt some type of way, but it was a hard decision that had to be made?
Yeah, I mean, you will always have that. Especially if you are running an organization of any size. And there will be certain decisions that you have to take, which are in the broader interest, which may not be in everybody's individual personal, or, for the best of every individual personal person, but it's like the broader interest that has to be served. So one of the things, for example, that I can point to is that, I, for example, have led a merger and acquisition process. And one of the things that you do when you go through a merger and acquisition process is that you're essentially bringing two organizations together. And very often, part of that is then figuring out, okay, for the good of this business, for the good of what we're trying to do, it makes sense for us to merge these two organizations. However, that is going to come with certain things. It means, for example, that we can't have two people doing one job if it's only one job that we have. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. Obviously, when you merge two organizations, you're going to have much more capacity, much more need for jobs and all of that, but it won't be for everybody. So it may be that it's 5% of people that it might affect, where you have that, you might have to take those tough decisions. And those are decisions that you have to face with honesty. You have to communicate. Most importantly, you have to be fair, and treat people fairly. And so, when you're taking those decisions, you're acting not just only in the interest of the owners of the business or only in the interest of you as the top managers of the business, but you also have to take into consideration of even those folks who are going to be affected by this. How do you cushion the impact on them? And how do you enable them to make transitions that they may need to make? How do you support them in that process? Because at the end of the day, even the people who are left behind must feel that the whole process was fair, that, this is a larger organization that they feel comfortable being a part of and working with into the future.
But you leave this safety net and then you decided to play in the chaotic waters of politics. Wow. Yeah.
So it's It's a good question. So a lot of people might look at, because my first foray into politics was maybe 2.5 years ago. And a lot of people look at it and think, well, okay, it's like a recent decision. But actually, it's maybe not a culmination, but it's another step in a process that probably started maybe over 10 years ago. Because that interest in governance matters has always been there. And I would say started to become a little bit more active maybe 10 years ago. So I wrote my first article on governance, published article, about 10 years ago, actually, in 2014, if I remember. And in fact, I was reading that article not too long ago. And it makes interesting reading, by the way. It's called Green Shoots of Governance. So clearly there was this interest in governance matters, right? Because, even when you're in the corporate world as I was then, a lot of what you're doing is you're playing in a sandbox that is created for you by the powers that be politically. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So the context is set by the political leadership, right? And that context affects not just businesses, it affects individuals, it affects families, it affects communities, right? And so, if you want to have good outcomes for all of these players within the economy, it starts from the governance level, right? And then plays out in the lives of these entities. So it was clear to me. And part of what I was doing then was commenting on what I observed in the governance sphere. And so that interest continued. And ultimately, when I eventually made the decision to enter into politics, I would say that it culminated in one realization, or it came as a culmination of one realization, which is that in a democracy, first of all, that part of the reason, or the main reason why we were so far from our potential as a nation and as a people, the main reason had to do with the failure of leadership. I was clear in my mind about that. Secondly, in a democracy, the only way you get to good leadership from a situation of failed leadership is if people who have the right intentions and the right capacity and the right understanding of what leadership represents, which we just spoke about 10 minutes ago, step forward. And then if they are supported to then occupy those seats where they can now make those changes. And there's just no two ways about it. That's the only path in a democracy. And so with that realization and realizing that I felt I had the capacity, I knew I had the right intention, that you can always make a case that let somebody else do it. Maybe that's why we've been in the situation where we've been for so long, because many people feel we let somebody else do it. Right. So it was clear to me that, this was something I should pursue. I thought about it for an extended period of time, prayed about it and all of those things. And ultimately made the decision that I was going to pursue this. And give it a shot. And, one has been, again, blessed with certain opportunities, possibilities, experiences, from an early age that one believes that one can bring to a role like this. And it's for us to put ourselves forward, and it's for the people to decide, whether or not they're going to give us that opportunity. I mean, obviously, there are other issues around it in terms of the process and the electoral process, which we can talk about at length. But you have to start from, your intention, your appeal to the people, and the people's acceptance or not of you. And then you take those other things. So that's kind of, it's really not more complicated than that. And that's how I ended up in politics. And, I've had one outing, and I would say we laid a good foundation. And we're now in the process of building on that foundation.
So how did you navigate the realization that, and the knowing that I have this capacity? Lagosians and Nigerians speaking back to you that they recognize that you have this capacity, and also now realizing that there's also the power play of party politics and the conversation of who are you aligned with or aligned to?
Yes. I think the first thing in any endeavor is to kind of figure out why you want to do something. There's a guy who wrote a book called Start With Why, which, I think is a great book. If you come across it, I recommend it. But once you figure out the why, then it's the how, and then the what, and all of those kinds of things. And so you remember I said that we had a initial outing where we laid a foundation. Part of what the decision that we made at that point was that we wanted to go with a non-mainstream platform. And so I contested for the governorship of Lagos on the platform of the ADC. And that was an opportunity to get into the field and to learn in that context and sort of figure out what's going on. And, many people would ask the question, right? Why a niche platform? Why a non-mainstream platform? Can you sort of prevail on a non-mainstream platform? And for us, I would say, for example, that if I had to do it all over again, I probably would do it the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is because what it did was allow us to go through the process, come through the nomination, come before the people, get the people an opportunity to experience me as an individual and understand the kinds of things that I stand for. And from there, you begin to build. And one of the things that many people told us, for example, without wanting to sound political, is that, we love the candidacy, but we're not sure about the platform. Right? So we thought you were one of the strongest, if not the strongest candidate in the race, but we didn't think the platform that you had could deliver. Now, the only reason they were able to say that was because we were before them, talking to them up to the point of the election. Do you see what I mean? Which, had we gone into a mainstream platform and gotten stuck in the nomination process, we wouldn't have that foundation to build upon today. So again, I'm using this question to answer your question, saying that, when you're engaging with a new process, I remember that, I have been in the corporate world for an extended period of time. And many corporate organizations actually are political organizations when you think about it, particularly the large organizations. So there's a way you engage the system, you learn, and then you build on it and build on it. And it's the same approach in this case. And so subsequently, taking the feedback from the people coming out of that process, was clear to us that what we now needed to do was, having given the people the opportunity to experience us, to now address the concern that they had, which is the platform concern, right? And ultimately, hopefully be in a position where in time we can present people with, a good candidacy on a strong platform.
So from the experience, I like that you're very clear on the way you wanted that run to play out. But now looking back, because this journey has spanned beyond 10 years from what you said. It's been a conversation, even from your first article in 2014. It's been a conversation in the works. What would you say, who are some of the people you say have been your mentors through this process? And did you need some form of mentorship, or did you think that your corporate experience and the politics of corporate was enough to now pivot into governance?
So I think one has mentors on different levels, right? So you have personal mentors, you have mentors in terms of leadership. You have people that you look up to and sort of understand the quality of their leadership style. Even though they're not direct mentors, but you sort of think of them as people that you may aspire to lead in those dimensions, right? So if you think about governance, for example, some of the qualities in terms of, governance outcomes that were produced under leaders like, Jakonde and Obafemi Awolowo are things that, you can point to and say that, in terms of the outcomes for the people, they were quite significant. Right. And everybody has their faults, and I'm sure you can point to faults of each and every individual. And this is a process that is ongoing, right? And one of the things that you will discover in the political realm is that you operate on many dimensions. You have many affiliations. You have affiliations that are loose affiliations. You have affiliations that are closer affiliations, and so on. Now, one of the things that you must also avoid, in my view, is you must avoid a you must be open to learning and advice, but you must avoid a godfather, godson kind of relationship, in my view, right? Because that is one of the things that has been an Achilles heel in our political realm in Nigeria, right? What you don't want is a leader who is a leader by proxy, right? Nigerians have to get to the point where they are electing their leaders to sit in the seat, right? As opposed to electing proxies who represent. Do you understand? So that the person who is sitting in the seat is exercising the power of the seat on the mandate of the people who put him there. And is therefore acting in the interest of the people who put him there. And if they are not happy with him, then they remove him and put somebody else to act in that position, right? So there's this balancing act where you must leave yourself open to learning, to advising, to being advised, to being guided, but you must always retain your independence and your ability to act independently on behalf of the people who put you into that seat, right? So this is very important. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why I felt it was important that you have you build up, right? So that when you come into a mainstream platform, you're not an unknown quantity. You see what I mean? You have a foundation, but you also have a tribe that understands what you stand for, right? So that even in your engagement with the mainstream platform, you are not engaging as a proxy. You are engaging as a known quantity, right? And hopefully there's a meeting of interests that understands that, look, what we need to do for the people, especially in an opposition context, is to provide them with a strong candidate that they can believe in on a platform that they think has the capacity to succeed. And then they can get behind that, right, as an alternative to the incumbent. So this is how I would answer that question.
With conversations around godfatherism and the godson relationship, it usually spawns from the need to get the elections funded. And that happens across. So for you, who was now in a new party,
non-mainstream
party, how did you navigate the conversations of monies, which is because everybody says politics is expensive? How did you navigate the conversation of money and retaining full independence as a candidate?
So let me not oversell it. Independence is never full over independence. Even in a corporate sense, if you are the MD of an organization, you're not fully independent. You know, there are boards that you are responsible to and all of that stuff, but nobody owns you. Do you see what I mean? You have to recognize people's interests. You have to balance interests. But ultimately, you will be the judge as to whether you will sacrifice the public interest in the pursuit of some of those vested or narrow interests. Do you see what I mean? So that's part of what people are voting for when they vote for a candidate. So that's the first point. The second is that, funding is always going to be a challenge, right? And people have to fund their campaigns. Obama had to fund his campaign. This happens all over the world, right? Now, part of it is, do people feel that you stand a chance? You see what I mean? Because funding is tied to that, right? If you're talking to potential funders of your campaign, a guy who gives you 1 million naira because he likes you and believes in you, is not convinced about whether your platform can deliver that victory, and gives you 1 million naira. That person could probably give you 50 million naira if he thought that the platform that you were on could deliver. Do you see what I mean? So those two things are intrinsically linked. And now part of the challenge also is that it is very difficult, I would say near impossible, to be as well funded as the incumbents a lot of the time, speaking generally. Because not just are they the incumbent, but the fact of incumbency in our climb creates an ecosystem around them of people who are eager, in fact, to fund that mechanism as a means of securing, their place within the ecosystem. Do you see what I mean? So that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, I would say that you actually don't need to be as well funded as the incumbent. So I think that that's a myth to think that, if the incumbent has 10 naira, you must have 20 naira in order to defeat the incumbent. I don't think so. I think with a fifth, the incumbent has 10 naira, with 20, with or 100 naira, with 20 naira well deployed, which is a fifth of that, it is possible to prevail. Why is that? Why do I say that? If you go around and you look at election time, right? Just drive around. How many posters of the incumbent are you going to see? How many posters, banners? It's everywhere, isn't it? It's everywhere. On the other hand, the opposition, you may see one for every 10 or 20, but that one may have more impact on you than the 20 of the incumbent that you see. Why? Because there's a sense in which you are desensitized to the 20. It's everywhere. You see what I mean?
Mm.
But that one alternative sort of stands out in the midst of the 20. I hope the point I'm making, you understand the point I'm making. Yeah. So there's that dynamic that's also at play. So do you need money? Certainly. Do you need to raise a lot of money? Certainly. But nobody has a monopoly on the desires of the people. Nobody has a monopoly on the goodwill of the people. The incumbent can only have their own base. There will inevitably be a base that is outside their own base. You see what I mean? And the key is that other base, do they believe that you are somebody that they can get around? Do they believe that you are somebody that they can get behind? Because that other base will always exist. Anywhere in the world, there will be the incumbent, but there will be the other base.
So do you have a friendship with the people who've, like the other candidates you ran with?
Do I have a friendship? I wouldn't say friendship. I'm acquainted with a few of them, not all. And yes, you say there's a relationship. Whether I would say a friendship, I wouldn't go as far as to say a friendship. In some cases, a cordial relationship. In some cases, a distant relationship. In some cases, no relationship. But yeah, that's how I would characterize it.
Okay. Now let's talk about policies. You've criticized what you've called unsustainable borrowing. Why is that?
My views around borrowing, there are a couple of things that drive my views around borrowing. And first of all, the first thing to say is that I don't have fundamentally a problem with borrowing. All governments borrow. Almost all governments borrow. I don't know if it's every single government, but there's nothing wrong with government borrowing. The question is, what are you using the money for? In other words, if you borrow and you're spending 1 million naira, are you getting 1 million naira of value for the 1 million naira that you are spending? Right? Or are you awarding a contract for 1 million naira that could have been awarded for 100,000 naira? Those two things are very different from one another. Right? So that's the first thing, the efficiency of the use of the money. Secondly, how are you prioritizing the things that you're using the money for? Right? So you can spend 1 million naira here or 1 million naira there. What is driving your decision as to which of those two options you are taking? Is it by considering what is likely to deliver the most benefits for the broad population? Or is it driven by other things like self-interest, that is a personal involvement in it, or a narrow set of powerful interests who may be driving a particular decision to go in a particular direction, which is not to the benefit of the larger, population. The third point I would make around borrowing is around foreign currency borrowing, particularly at the state level, subnational level. So, as someone who's managing a state, you have to be very careful about how much you borrow in foreign currency, because your revenue sources are not in foreign currency. You are taxing, your tax base is individuals, domestic. It's a naira tax base. You're not producing oil which you're selling in foreign currency or anything like that. So you have to be careful. And this is an area where I think that Lagos State perhaps has been a bit irresponsible, right, in terms of the proportion of their loans that are foreign currency loans, right, which, by the way, at current rates exceeds the domestic borrowing, right? Because if you borrow in dollars, $1 billion, and the rate goes from 300 to 1,700, you can imagine what that means for your debt. And Lagos State has over $1 billion in debt, in foreign currency debt. So borrowing per se is not bad. It's not a crime, particularly where you have the capacity to fund the borrowing. But for these reasons that I've spoken, you have to be careful. And in particular, borrowing in foreign currency for a subnational entity, you also have to be very careful. The final point I'll make on this is that, a lot of the time, in justifying expenditures, governments will come forward and say, look, this is our budget. It's 2 trillion. We are spending 1.4 trillion on capital expenditure and only 600 billion on recurrent expenditure. And therefore, we are doing well because we are spending most of the money on capital expenditure, right? Mm-hmm. You hear that all the time. But the reality is that is only telling one part of the story. The question is that how well is that capital expenditure being spent? Because if you tell me you are spending 1.5 trillion on capital expenditure, the question I ask you is that what value are you getting for that 1.5 trillion that you are spending? Not just the fact that you are spending 1.5 trillion. Because if you spend 1.5 trillion and you get 1.5 trillion of value, and I spend 1.5 trillion and I get only 200 billion of value, you have done great, but I have done terribly. You see what I mean? Mm. So sometimes when you see us challenging what government may be doing on a particular thing, this is what is driving it. So sometimes you hear, for example, government awarding trillion naira contracts without competitive bidding. How do you do that and ensure you are getting value for money? Do you see what I mean? You have to have that, which the law provides for, by the way, that says get people to bid competitively so that you are getting the best price for what you are spending money on.
So now looking at this standpoint, because and even with just a few days ago, I think yesterday, in the news, a lot of these conversations are happening as regards conversations around budget because of the 2025 budget. So a lot of these conversations are put into context, yes. But when you now think of the fiscal challenges of Lagos State, in your own opinion, how can we fix those challenges without stifling the growth of the millions of people who have called Lagos their home?
So that's a very good question. And it's a multi-layered question. The first thing is that you have to block the leakages. And there are a lot of leakages in governance. Some of them are the things that I've talked about here. Right? If you have, it's like you have a basket. If you are pouring water into a basket, it's going to take a lot of water to fill that basket. It will never fill. Right? So if you have excessive leakages as a government, the money you have will never be enough. It's like a household. So that's the first thing. Part of the leakages, by the way, is that the people who are supposed to pay taxes, the people who are supposed to pay what they are supposed to pay, you ensure that they pay. Don't leave the powerful to go and harass the people who can fight back for the pennies that you're trying to get from them. Right? So that is a second point. The third point is that if you govern properly and you touch on some of these things that I have talked about, what will happen is that the society itself will become more prosperous in a broad-based way. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That dynamic that I talked about, which is a negative dynamic that ends up concentrating resources in a few hands, will operate in a different way, such that the wealth will be spread, right, in a broad-based way, creating capacity within the people themselves, who then become the engines of productivity. Do you see what I mean? So that you, in every economy where you've had this sustainable push into prosperity, rapidly increasing standards of living and so on, is never done by a narrow minority of it. It's because the society, in a broad-based way, has developed the capacity to become productive and is now the engine of that productivity. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And that is what you must do in Lagos. We must invest in the human capital rather than bemoaning our fate that we have a large population. We should invest in that population and make them the engines of our productivity. Think of it as an asset, but you have to invest in that asset to make it a productive asset. And that's what we have to do. And there are a range of things that must be done to accomplish that. So, for example, realizing that much of that population is a young population. The median age in Nigeria is about 18 years. That tells you that half of the population is 18 years and below. Half. In Nigeria, that's about 100 million people. Right? There's nothing to make us believe that Lagos is necessarily different from that. I don't have the figures for Lagos, by the way. But we can imagine that it will be a similar kind of structure. You must invest in these people. If you invest in them, they will become your weapon, your secret weapon in the future. If you don't invest in them, they will become your Achilles heel in the future. So what does investing in them mean? First of all, you have to think about their health. So healthcare, for example, for children below a certain age should be free. It should be free. Right? Education up to a certain level should be free. And not just free in mouth alone, where you charge this, and just say there's no fee. No, it should be free. Up to a certain level. Then, in addition to formal academic education, you have to provide for technical education. Everybody wants to go and become a clerk or what have you. So people from JS3 onwards can learn a trade in 3 or 4 years if you have a massive investment in technical education. By the way, this is what the society needs. Right? The society needs more clerks? Maybe not. The society needs more builders, more electricians? Maybe. Right? Because when you do this, you are empowering those people to become productive. Even if they can't get a job, somebody to employ them, they can do something from the next day, right? Which they start to then build wealth, right? Which contributes to the wealth of society. Importantly, one of the things that it will also do for you is that it makes you, it makes this population useful in 2 ways to people looking in from the outside. One, they are a more attractive market because they have greater economic capacity. But they are also a source of qualified, capable talent that you can then site your businesses beside. Because you have a pool of technical talent that you can tap into. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So all of these things become mutually reinforcing, right? They all work together so that ultimately then you move from a situation where you have a concentrated wealth society to a broad-based, prosperous society. And this transition is a transition that is very possible, especially within Lagos, because Lagos has the good fortune of being in a position today where other states are trying to get to. I don't know if you get what I mean by that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you ask many states, the governors in many states, what they will tell you is that they are trying to attract businesses, they are trying to get people to come and all of that stuff, isn't it? So that they can start from there, right? Building the wealth of the society. But that's where Lagos is starting from. The businesses are there. People come, people come here. And they've been here, by the way, for centuries. So this is not new, right? So we have a great opportunity, if we manage it right, to make this transition where the society itself becomes more productive and then becomes the engine of productivity. And by the way, this thing that I'm talking about will benefit not just Lagos, it will benefit Nigeria. Because people who have studied countries, societies that have made this transition have found that very often, not always, but very often, these countries have emerged on the back of the emergence of their coastal regions. Because the coastal regions have their, some of these factors in place, which we've talked about, to kickstart that process. And then the whole nation is dragged along. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So we have a peculiar responsibility to manage Lagos well.
I hear all of that. And when you look at Lagos in the last 4 years, even 8 years, there's been a lot of investment in new industries and the need for a lot of investment in newer industries, like ventures like the revamp of the National Theatre, revamp of Eco Festival, revamp of things like that to just excite the growing industries like entertainment, digital tech, and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your own opinion, but then still, with all of these revamps and reboot of and knowing of these industries, there's still a 42%, according to the research, of people who are unemployed. So how can we fix that?
Again, it's this thing that I talked about where you have to give the people the skills that make them productive, that the skills that the society needs. If your educational system is training in one direction, but the skills that the economy needs is in a different direction, you have a mismatch, right? We're not about office jobs. Office jobs are great, right? But we cannot absorb everybody into office. We just cannot. Right? So we have to look for ways in which to give people the capacities to produce, to be productive, right? We have to invest in the things that will cause businesses to not just site here, but to grow their operations here and then to operate in a way here that empowers the local economy. Not to treat Lagos as a market to import things through the port and sell to the people here, but to treat Lagos as a base of production that, yes, has a local market within close proximity, but more importantly, has a working infrastructure, technically capable people who can man their factories, right? Such that Lagos then becomes a productive base from which you can service not just the local economy, but you can service external markets, export, and so on. Because we're right here on the coast. We're right here on the coast, and our geographical position is advantageous. And other countries have managed these endowments well, and that's what has taken. If you take Singapore, what does Singapore have? That is the only thing that Singapore has. That geographic position is the only thing that Singapore has. They have nothing other than that. But they maximized it. And we can do a lot more to do that when we have a lot more, not just the geographical advantage. We have many other advantages, by the way. The other point that I will emphasize here in answer to this question is that, and this is one of the things that I have said we would adopt, given the opportunity, is a regional strategy. You see, you have to have a regional development strategy. Because that way you are much stronger. Because the things you don't have. So, for example, if you have a regional development strategy in the Southwest that involves Ogun, Oyo, and so on and so forth, They have land, we don't. Right? We have population that they don't have. We have access to the coast that they don't have. You see what I mean? We have financial center that they perhaps do not have. We have maybe a base of existing industry that maybe they do not have. But when we put ourselves together as a block, right? We don't have to go to the level of political union. No, that's not what I'm saying. But in having a regional development strategy, we can say, okay, here is what we can do, for example, in the agri space, right? Here is how we can essentially have access to land, a trained population to farm that land, industry to do agro-processing on what is being produced by that land, and which we can export through the access that we have to the coast and the markets. That is something that when you are thinking collectively, you can have an integrated plan to do, which you sitting down here in Lagos alone cannot do. And they sitting down there alone cannot do. So as part of this idea of essentially getting people productive, getting people prosperous, getting people working, creating jobs, creating economic activity that is meaningful, sustainable, that can improve people's lives and pull them out of poverty. These are the building blocks.
A lot of these building blocks are hinged on a transparent government.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to adopt this regional plan, it would be, I would assume that would be hinged very greatly on transparency between all the parties who come together. Speaking about this, you've sued the federal government over the Lagos Calabar Highway procurement process. And then you've also written several letters asking for more transparency in several others. Why is transparency a cornerstone in your approach towards government?
You see, transparency is critical, right? You see, governance, even if you have the right intentions and you are transparent and you are honest, governance is not easy because we're in a competitive world. You understand? Talk less of if the transparency and the intention is not there, then it becomes an impossible task. So it should not surprise you if after 60 years of independence, we are still struggling, or 30 years in the latest dispensation, or 25 to 30 years in the latest dispensation of democracy, nationally and in Lagos. Because it should not surprise you, right? Because the building blocks of capacity, the right strategies, and the right intentions are not in place. That's why transparency is critical. If your intention is that this is what I want to accomplish, then your desire, your approach is more, how can I accomplish this thing that I want to accomplish? Do you see what I mean? That's why transparency, it is critical. It's not the only thing that is needed. You need capacity, it's not. So I'm not making the case that once you have transparency, everything is solved. No. But if you don't have it, you will not develop sustainably. If you go and look at countries and just even do a chart of countries which countries have achieved high living standards, and then look at their corruption and transparency index, you see that there's a very close correlation. Those countries that have high standards of living have low corruption indices, and vice versa. So it tells us something, and it's something that we all intuitively know. You understand? We don't need theories to tell us. If you ask the man on the street, he can probably tell you that part of the reason why we are where we are, a big part of the reason why where we are, is because many of the leaders who have led us do not have the interests of the larger society at heart. They are more interested in personal interests and so on and so forth. The average person will tell you this. It's not rocket science.
That's okay.
Yeah, it's not rocket science.
So we've come to the end, but then there's a final question, which is 10 years from now, what would you want your impact on Lagos and the Nigeria to be?
Part of what I am convinced of is the fact that already we're having a big impact on governance without even being in the seat of governance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because some of the things that we're telling governments and telling the people that government should be doing is actually affecting the actions of government. You understand? So some of that impunity and so on and so forth, when we write what we do and we take them to court or whatever, it influences their behavior. You see what I mean? So you started there. But more importantly, given the opportunity to occupy a seat of a driver's seat, I would expect that in 10 years, Lagos will be well on its way to becoming a first world city. Because the foundations would have been laid, the culture would have been changed within government. You may not get to the decision, but you can change the culture within government within 2 terms of a governor's office. You can change the culture. And one of the when I sort of look at it in 2 buckets, the way I view it is reform the government, prioritize the people. A lot of what we've talked about here today is about prioritizing the people. Reforming the government is the other big leg of it. What does reforming the government mean? Transparency, deal with corruption, deal with self-interest and impunity, put in a culture of meritocracy, and then improve compensation. Again, it's not rocket science. People will tell you from morning till night why it cannot be done in government. It's not true. If it can be done in the largest corporate organizations, it can be done in government. But what will make the difference as to whether it will or will not be done in government is the commitment of the person at the apex of the system. If the person at the apex of the system is committed that this is what's going to happen, in 2 terms, you can make it happen. One of the things that you will see, if you look at our climb, and this goes to the question you asked me much earlier as to why I decided to go into politics. You see, we have not had a shortage of good people who come into government, usually in an appointive role. So if somebody is elected as president or what have you, he brings in 1 or 2 people who are good people and appoints them to particular positions, right? And they work very hard. They work very hard for 4 years, maybe 8 years, right? Harder maybe than even they worked in the private sector. But, give it 2 years after they've gone. You can't really see the impact, right? We're back. And the reason is because the opportunity to make lasting change, institutional change, is in the seat of elective office, not appointive office. Because those guys who pull them in and say, come and do this work, what they are doing is they are creating a sandbox. And then they say, okay, enter that sandbox and help me sort out inside this sandbox within the boundaries of what I'm comfortable with you doing. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. But the larger elective office is where the long-term institutional change is made.
So this has been a really enlightening 1 hour of conversations. And I do believe that we could genuinely feel your heart. And I believe that every person who engages this conversation, our listeners and viewers on the Good News Niger podcast, will feel the same. So thank you very much for sharing your love for Lagos with us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.